I refer to myself as a baseball simulator. I wasn't actually talking about the software here. So that's just a title page to cover in case we needed to do this. Anyway, so I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories. I love to tell stories. It's kind of the nickname I have when I work in corporate America as a storyteller. Anyway, I drew this in 1968, which is just sort of a preamble to what happened in my life here. So I grew up in LA. I was the very first television sports game I ever watched. I watched with my mother, and it was Sandy Koufax pitching to Mickey Mantle in the '63 World Series. I remember sitting in the room with her and watching that, learning all about Sandy Koufax in particular, being a Dodgers fan and all of that. But I was also a big Mickey Mantle fan, because who wasn't in those days? Almost every night in the summer, I'd sit around the radio with my dad and listen to Vin Scully. And during the basketball season, it was all about Chick Hearn. I don't know if you guys know Chick Hearn. I know you all know who Vin Scully is, but Chick Hearn was he wasn't quite Vin Scully, but he was pretty great. And he was the voice of the Lakers. And I grew up with that trio of Lakers first, right? Chamberlain, West, and Elgin Baylor. But I was also, oddly enough, I was a Packers fan. I don't know why, but the other big sports event that I remember watching on television was the first couple Super Bowls, where Paul Hornung and Bart Starr were the big superstars. And to that, and I played a lot of sports when I was younger. I still play. I always wore number 5, always. It was because of him. Anyway, and as a kid, I took these things, back into my room and got my sketch pad out, and I was always, I don't know, just trying to bring it into my house, right? And so there's that picture from the first page. But I also did a lot of sports. There's Chamberlain and West, right? Playing the Celtics. This is, me falling in love with Brooks Robinson at third base, right, during the World Series. And I think, when did the Orioles play? I know they played in '70, but I think they played once in the '60s as well. Anyway, so the vacuum over at third base. And then also I picked this one specifically. I know it's a little hard to see, but you can see this is a Green Bay Packers helmet. So it's kind of a TV shot from behind where the players are on the sidelines. So I was big into that sort of stuff. We used to build stadiums in our living rooms with unit blocks and string. We'd take a roll of string and put it by one of the armchairs and make a 90-degree, cross like that, and run it out to the couches. I didn't even know Fenway had a big wall in those days. I didn't know, because it was in LA, right? And I missed the Coliseum. But anyway, so we'd make unit blocks on the rest of it to make a stadium. Then we got out a golf pencil and a white marble, and we'd bat the ball around inside in the living room. So that's kind of how I grew up. And then all of a sudden I got introduced to APBA. And it was through football. My brother and I can't tell you how much time we spent playing APBA football. And it got to the point, it's just part of the aptitude that I had, where I just got to the point where I just beat him no matter what team I had. I just understood, not only the strategy of how to pick the teams, but how to influence the way the model, that big board. I assume most of you have seen those if you haven't played with them, those big boards of statistical outcomes. And I, for some reason, was able to sort of grok that and just, I had an aptitude for that, and I loved that game. We played that for years and years. And you can see I made sports pages out of my sort of fantasy sports stuff, which, as you all know, we didn't have in those days. And over here, I brought this in here because even in my tweens, I was making physics models of tennis, right? I'm not a very tall person. So I really wanted to know, what was the optimal angle to serve a tennis ball to clear the net, right? I wasn't thinking about gravity, obviously, but still I was drawing these kinds of things and doing all the arithmetic to figure out, all the stuff, which, all came back. And then a weird twist of fate kind of happened. Growing up sort of in the golden age of education in Southern California, I went to a very large high school, and we had a remarkable orchestra program. And as part of that program, we ended up playing pit orchestra music for the school musicals. And being a good athlete and being exposed to all the arts is like, I'd rather be up on the stage dancing than sitting down here in the pit. And so I talked to one of my girlfriends, and she started taking me to her ballet classes. And so while I was doing all of this, including playing sports, I was also taking ballet classes. I got very serious about it. And so when I went to college, that became a thing. And in college, I went to a small liberal arts college, and Thomas Watson, who's pictured here in the middle, before he passed away, set up a grant for students at liberal arts colleges to go study weird things overseas outside of academia. He really felt it was important for students to go study things that weren't associated with, your typical master's and PhD programs. And so one of my friends had said, well, look, you do math, you figured out how to do computers, and you're into ballet, you got to be able to figure out something that these people will be interested in. And so it turns out that the ballet world, unlike the music world, doesn't have a notation system of any usefulness. And so I had, in my linear algebra classes, figured out how to rotate objects in 3 dimensions using a language called APL, which some of you may know, which is really great with linear algebra and matrix equations, which is particularly good and relevant for rotating objects in 3 dimensions, and then projecting them onto a 2-dimensional screen. And so that's, in fact, what happened. I got a grant to go to England and throughout Europe, and I would take class with the ballet companies around Europe, and I'd talk to them about using computers, and most of them had no idea what I was talking about. It was way too soon. This was done on an Apple II in England in 1980 and 81. It was the 5th Apple II ever sold to England. We literally put a little heat. It's very damp in England for those of you who haven't been. We used to put a heater next to it so it could boot up. And so I came up with the system that would animate this human, and it was at 6 frames a second, which I didn't think about it at the time, but later it comes to be an important factor in my career. And at the same time, I was still on my way to England. I stopped and took a summer and studied in ballet in New York. And I was staying with a college friend of mine, and she introduced me to terminal text-based games like Zork. So I would do ballet during the day, and then I'd come home and I'd boot up her equipment on, one of those 300 baud modems, acoustic modems, and started playing adventure games. So all this starts, to come together. And so I do the research, I do the work, I spend a year abroad, I come up with the system, I'm able to animate characters. And then when I come home, I visit a friend of mine who, a childhood friend, and he had an Intellivision. And being overseas, I actually hadn't even heard of Atari, even though Atari was around, just had become the thing. But he had an Intellivision, and he had this baseball game, and we spent hours playing that baseball game, and I thought that was pretty cool. And then I went to visit a guy named David Warhol, who is a year or two younger than I am, and was still at my college. And I went to visit him at the computing center. And I'm chatting with him, and I noticed a little blue piece of paper on his desk. And at my college, that was from the career planning and placement office. And I'm looking at it upside down, and I can see the word Intellivision on it. And I asked David what it was. And I said, do you mind if I also apply for this job? David and I went and talked to Don Daglow, who had also went to our college, who had interviewed us, hired us both on, he hired us to both start working on the same day. But when I interviewed with Don, I came in with this magazine cover, and I said, look, Don, this is what I can do. I can do big animations on relatively, I didn't think slow at the time, computers that kind of run it like an Apple II. And Don turns to me and says, and I'm doing a gross, modification of the conversation, but basically he says, I've always wanted to do a video baseball game based on the statistical model that I have in my head that looks like television. And that was fundamentally our entire real interview, was that conversation, was that sentence that he said to me. And then we did the usual business of, am I technically able to work on it's a 10-bit processor, the Intellivision, so it's a little bit weird. And so I did all that. I came to work for Don, and, that was really the beginning of, what we're really here to talk about, which was, the beginning of my career making simulators. And, Don and I were pretty well joined at the hip on this, right? I know, am I correct in assuming you all know who Don is? Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, Don, and if you haven't read his book, The Fog Cellar, you should read it. He's a really fine writer, and it's a really great story. It's a fun read. Anyway, so Don and I start the project. We actually had a third person involved, but he eventually rolled off. I was pretty young at the time, and I have to be honest, I kind of pushed him out. I was a bit of a control freak. I suppose I still am, and didn't really work out. He wasn't really, I don't think he was really grasping what we were attempting to do. So Don lays out this strategy for how he wants the game to simulate baseball. And I'm not sure how much you guys know about it, but it was a pretty, in retrospect, it was a very logical approach to doing it. It wasn't all that different in many respects from the card-based games that we all played with dice and, look up tables and things like that. But knowing we were going to do it on a computer, he had a nice, very elegant algorithm for making that work. And Don had really, really studied it for a long time about how to do it. He also understood, for having been in Intellivision 2 years before me, the technical limitations of trying to make this all work. So that was the beginning. But I then turned to Don at some point and said, one of the problems with the current games and the way you're thinking about it is that everything's very pixel oriented. So a ball's a home run because it literally is the pixel above the fence on the screen. And I said, I can't remember exactly how I explained it to him, but I said it would be way easier and give us a lot more flexibility if we made a 3D model of a ballpark and use your strategy to predict the outcome and then let the ball loose, right? And Don, he was an outstanding manager, didn't push back a whole lot. We had great conversations about how to do that. And these are slow computers. And one of the things, and you tell me if you don't want to hear some of this technical stuff, but to me, it's as much the fascinating sort of solutions to these problems. Same problem was true in the Apple II, and trying to do all this linear algebra to move a human. Is you learn all these interesting shortcuts. And one of the interesting shortcuts in all of this world is using logarithms. And one of the reasons that we use logarithms is because the slowest possible thing you could do is a square root. And doing 3D modeling is just full of things with roots in them. And so what we did is we created these lookup tables when you booted up both the Intellivision game and the Apple II dance notation thing. The first thing we did is we rolled out a set of log tables, right? So that we could very rapidly do the kind of arithmetic it takes to move a 3D model around. So we started working from that. And, the term VR, if it was invented then, no one knew it. We certainly didn't talk about it, but basically we were making a virtual reality game inside the machine. So before we saw even a pixel on the screen, we had baseball running in the computer. And to me, this is the hallmark of everything that Don and I ultimately invented for this and then Earl Weaver Baseball, was this notion of the stats and physics model, where we were modeling the game, but the event at the plate, in other words, when the ball comes to the plate, that event is calculated statistically, and then the physics takes over what's going on. That's what allowed us to eventually move the fences and, put AstroTurf in and, artificial turf and grass, allow wind conditions to come in and a bunch of other things. It was all built on the premise of what we did here at Intellivision. So that was not something that most of the people were terribly comfortable with. Not that they didn't like the ideas, is a lot of them just didn't know how that was going to happen. And fortunately for me, I'd sort of been through it with my postgraduate work. So that was sort of a very large step A was creating that construct. And then the big step B was, how are we going to show this? Well, this is at an arc in the video games industry when Intellivision was starting to get enough traction that they started to invest in add-ons. And for those of you who had an Intellivision, you know there were slots you could add things in. And so periodically throughout this project, Don and the team would come to, or the team would come to me and Don, or Don would come to me and we'd say, hey, you know, we have a new memory module, so you can do more stuff. So we had to sort of revamp things and say, wow, we can do more stuff. So how do we make bigger players? How do we make, you know, Don's thing happen where we have multiple camera angles? And so unlike what we're all used to today, you know, I drew a bunch of different camera angles that we thought would be representative. And it's one of the reasons that I showed the drawings. It's like, clearly I've been somehow subconsciously paying attention to this as a kid. And it's not hard to look at a video. Well, I don't think we really had much videotape then, but we all watched enough TV. We knew what the 5 or 6 main angles were for baseball. And so we started drawing, right? This is very pixel intensive. There's all kinds of interesting technical limitations for putting multiple colors on a screen like this. It's actually, you're literally writing code as the CRT gun is traversing down the screen, and you're actually making changes to the gun as it moves, you know, on row, you know, whatever, to pixel position, whatever, and you literally can change things so it's all about timing. So there's all of that work is going on at the same time. So we had to kind of think about that. Anyway, so, you know, we built that view on the left here, this view here, you know, that was, you know, the first view that we built. And, you know, we kind of went from there. And then, you know, we're following these 2 tracks. We're trying to make this stuff look like television. We created interstitials like this, which, you know, was I think a pretty important breakthrough, at least in our work, to say, okay, everything we do to make it feel like television is like, okay, so when a batter comes up, you know, we want to make an interstitial moment, you know, where it comes up. We want to be able to show a slightly better graphic than this for, you know, for what the players look like. And then I don't remember, it was a very long time ago, but it was really dumb to have Willie Mays come up there and be a white guy. Just dumb, right? And so it's like, well, we're going to have black ball players in here, right? And I'll be honest, we didn't say black, Hispanic, and people of color. We just said black, right? So it's like we put a setting in their data set that said this is a black player, and unfortunately, no one captured one in the Wayback Machine. But some of those players come up, they're black, and I gotta be honest, didn't make me, I didn't think anything about it until we found out that Major League Baseball was not going to license us the names of the players. And Mattel, which is really a toy company, was like, oh, we're not going to, you know, we don't want the, you know, heirs of, we don't want Joe DiMaggio, who was still alive at the time. We don't want Joe DiMaggio to come and sue us for using his name without his permission, and so on and so forth. So what we did is we took the stats for, I think it was really only 2 teams worth of players. It might have been more. Maybe one of you remembers how many players. There might have been a whole truckload of players in there. Honestly, I can't remember. And we gave them all, we used their real stats. So there's a Babe Ruth in there somewhere. Matter of fact, is this Babe Ruth? No, no, it's not. But those might be the accumulated stats. And the reason I think it's Babe Ruth is because we gave everybody names in the system that were either friends of ours or staff people. And Lily Dahlgren was the receptionist at Intellivision. I think her name was Lily. And so we called her Babe Dahlgren. And the lawyers at Intellivision said, nope, can't do that. Can't use Babe. So anyway, that's where all the names came from. And the reason I brought up the thing about the black players is that, you know, we assigned one of the staff members to be Willie Mays. You know, we thought, great, you know, you get to have some of the best stats out there. And the guy was like surprisingly upset that he didn't want his name. It wasn't even his full name. he didn't want any part of his name associated with a black player. And, it's always surprising when you hear stuff like this and things like this happen, but it happened. And we chose to honor his request and we gave it to somebody else. But, that was kind of a weird moment. Anyway, I'm trying to think if there's, so they added another unit, the voice unit. And so who, of course, are Don and I going to try and get to do the voice? Vin Scully, right? And, this is pretty early days. This is 1982. Vin Scully's people were not hearing it. They were just not going to let him do the play-by-play voice in the system. So we recorded other people doing it, but we had to write sort of Mad Lib style scripts to call the play-by-play. Which for all of you EWB fans know is like that comes back in the Amiga version in a big way. And then I think, those are kind of the Intellivision stories. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything else.
Hey, Eddie, I was just going to mention with the Intellivision game, that factor, the timing factor with the crash of the video game industry.
Oh yeah.
And also the fact that you had, I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, this was one of the few or maybe the only game that required the IntelliVoice and the computer module.
It did. It was the only one, I'm pretty sure, that required pretty much every add-on that they had. And you couldn't be more right. The timing was horrendous. So that's a good way to sort of wrap up this part of it, which is we went to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. People were frankly pretty wowed. We did a whole commercial set with George Plimpton, who was kind of the spokesperson for Intellivision sports games, and we were really on a roll for the release, and then just the roof fell in on the industry, and it was pretty heartbreaking, I have to say. And, but still, we did it, we got it out there. Enough people saw it, enough people understood what we did that I'm, very proud of the work. And, and as you all know, led on to, what came next. So there was a bit of a hiatus between me and Don. Don moved back to his roots up in San Rafael and went to work at EA. And EA had this huge success with Dr. J and Larry Bird Go One-on-One. And Don was not involved in that, but he was at EA. And you can imagine Trip Hawkins, the CEO at EA, saying, well, if we can do it with this celebrity, right, what other celebrities can we do with? And Don, I'm sure everybody knew Don was a big baseball fan. Trip Hawkins is also a big baseball fan, but fortunately for me and Don, he's a bigger football fan. So he was in the knitting of the guys doing Madden football, and I know a lot of those guys because it wasn't a very big community in those days. And he got into our knitting, and I'll tell some stories about that. But he mostly sort of stayed, focused on that. So this was really up to me and Don, and this really started as EA Baseball. It was not a big leap for us to say, okay, we're going to do the same thing but better. Right. And not only that, based on the deals that EA was able to make, we're going to get the MLB and the MLBPA licenses, and we're going to use real players. And Don had continued to do more research and done some refining of the original model idea. And we were going to put it on a computer, and, enough time had elapsed that we thought we were going to be able to, draw fields and, do better computer animation. But, for those of you who especially saw the Amiga version, which I actually have a clip coming up from it, the jump from here to, Earl Weaver Baseball and Chuck Yeager Flight Simulator, which was the other one that kind of came out at the same time on the Amiga, pretty astounding, I think, in a lot of ways. So we all knew it was coming. So, they positioned me and Don particularly well. The choice of doing the Amiga was pretty interesting and was technologically quite fun. The guy who built it, RJ Michael, was part of the community that we all worked in, and I still have it. I actually had a hand-wrapped version of the motherboard, right? It was, and every now and then they'd send, parts to like attach to it. So we were in the early days at the Amiga. It was pretty fun. We got to, find some other stuff. And, this is when EA had the equipment to start helping digitize some images. So that picture of Earl, that's in the lower right here and in the Ask Earl screen, without the equipment, it was very expensive for them to do. Everything would have been hand drawn. So even the picture in the background here, even though it's a pretty low fidelity image, is based on a photograph. So anyway, Don brought me in. I must have been, I want to say 8 or 9 months into the project before they signed Earl. So, the basic model had been built. So this was an interesting thing that goes back to the dance notation thing. I took that program and I refactored it to draw baseball parks. And so I took it and I could use the rotation scheme in that to figure out what all the right looks were for the baseball parks that we were going to draw, because we were still not in a place where we could rotate them in even pseudo real time. So we had to pick static views. And so I did that to figure out what the right angles were, what the equations were to project those angles, onto a screen of the right dimensions and all of that stuff. And so Don makes the deal with Earl, this is the outcome of what that is. This is, someone made a GIF of this. I literally ran into it as I was preparing this. And I kind of went through this with my daughter an hour or so ago. And I'm just going to talk through this because there's just a lot of stuff that's going on here. So there's that TV thing again, that TV interstitial moment. And I know you're all baseball fans, so this is none of this is gonna be news to you, but the fact that we have the shortstop going out to do the cutoff and then, or to do the relay and then switch to the cutoff, right? All of that stuff, right? The pitcher's coming down, I'm pointing to my other screen, the pitcher's coming down to back up the catcher, right? Pretty much everybody's moving. The first baseman comes across, right, to handle the cutoff in case the shortstop does the relay, right? And then the last thing I'll point out is watch the right fielder very closely. Notice he's standing there and then he shifts and then he shifts again, right? All that little movement, right, was all stuff that, it's just all those little details that, Don and I spent a lot of time talking about, making it feel more alive. And the other thing is, well, I'm going to get back to the statistics and physics model in a minute. I want to get back to it. So Trip Hawkins, as you know, is the founder of Electronic Arts. When I first had this running like this, we didn't have any of the digitized images. So they were kind of, they weren't as bad as the Intellivision images, but they were basically images that I did on graph paper. And, I forget how many frames it is, but this is running at 10 frames a second. So, that's probably, a dozen or so frames. And, the picture mechanics were based on some photographs that I was using out of books. But the plan was that I brought those books to a meeting up at EA. I was in LA, so we went up to EA and I brought the books and I said, I need you to digitize these 12 images for me. And then I'm going to stitch them together. And I'm going to make it so we can change uniform colors and skin color and stuff like that, and make them left-handed or right-handed. But all of those positions come out of a set of, I think, 3 or 4 books. And they're an amalgamation of I know Tom Seaver's in there, Carlton's in there, Bob Gibson, I think, is in there, and a bunch of other pitchers that you would know the names of. I just don't remember who they are off the top of my head. Likewise with the batter. But Tripp, he is funny, I was still a pretty young man. Tripp comes to me when he sees it and he goes, those animations are just too cartoonish. And instead of being sort of like, yeah, you're right, totally agree, but we have a whole thing planned with Mike Kawahara, who's the head art director, to digitize things, and really it will look like, a proper, photographic style animation. Instead, I got really pissed off. I gave him a piece of my mind. It's like, that's not the point. And I was not very gracious about it. He was not wrong. But, we had anticipated that we were going to do that anyway. But anyways, so that's that's part of what's going on here. So what else do I, so I'm going to go back and talk about Earl a bit. I think it's pretty important. So like I said, we have a lot of this already working, right? They bring in Earl to be the strategy guy, and they fly everybody into San Mateo, where the office was, or Redwood City, where the office was. And we're all waiting for Earl in this big glass conference room. He has this beautiful facility that even then in 1985, 86, somewhere in there. And we see the limo pull up, right? And Earl and Tripp come out of the limo through the glass doors, right? Into the conference room. He introduces Earl all around, and then he turns to Earl and says, "Would you like a tour of the building?" And Earl says, "No, I came here to do some work. Let's get going." And that really set the tone for how he was for the next, 5 years that I worked with the man. He was astounding to work with. He comes from a working background, and that's what he was there to do. He was getting paid to work. And every time we asked him to do something, he made himself available to do it. And at the end of the next day, which was a very long day, same kind of thing happened. Tripp, and I don't mean to throw Tripp under the bus, but he kind of walked under it on his own. Tripp came to him and he said, "So look, I know we've got some more situations to go through, but we've been here a long time. You want to, why don't we break for dinner and we can pick this up tomorrow?" And Earl looks at me and Don, we're sitting next to each other. Don and I spent a long time prepping a bunch of papers. And he goes, "They still have more questions to ask me. We're staying here till they're done." And again, it was great. And the things that we asked him, Don and I worked up these worksheets for every situation we could think of, right? And instead of just sort of blowing us off and talking about, well, this is what you do, he said, "Okay, everybody stand up. You be the left fielder. You be the shortstop." He literally walked us through all the relay plays, all the cutoff plays, all the backups, everything. And so, he kind of gave us a boot camp on Major League Baseball defense, and a lot of us had played as, little league and high school ball. And so it wasn't all that foreign, but still it was just wonderful to have him, coaching us through what we did. And then we'd ask him questions about, other kinds of situations like relief pitchers and stuff like that. And he worked with us. We filled out all those forms, and those forms became the strategy that was part of the one thing that we didn't have one of the things we didn't have in the Intellivision was a strategy that would manage the team, pick the lineups, do the pinch hitting, do the pinch running, obviously put people in the bullpen and bring them in from the bullpen, whether or not to walk people or pitch around them. He talked a lot about pitching around batters, surprisingly. How to know, this is a fun little story. He goes, when I would go out to the mound and ask the pitcher how he was doing, he said, "I would just ignore the pitcher. I only listen to what the catcher said." And so, that was, he just had all these little gems that he would drop on us about how we would approach strategy in the game. And all of that's in the code, right? One of the things he said was, is to pay attention to which direction the foul balls come off on long foul balls. His comment was, if they start pulling foul balls, you need to get the pitcher out of there, right? And so in the model, we actually simulate that, right? As the pitcher gets more tired, they throw more balls that get pulled. And so if you watch really, really carefully, it's hard. Watch really, really carefully, you can actually sort of be on top of that, seeing that the foul balls are getting pulled into the stands, and it's time to get that pitcher out of there pretty soon. So, a lot of that kind of stuff came from those meetings of us just taking copious notes. And like I said, Don and I spent a lot of evenings at his house, prepping these sheets so that we would have all of his strategy. There's another fellow at EA named Bing Gordon. I don't know if you guys know his name, but Bing was really Tripp's partner. He did every single job except the CEO job at EA. He was really the head of marketing, but he's just a brilliant guy. And we were at another event up at EA. They would have us come up a lot. All of us who were making games for EA, they'd have us come up and work, as a community together. And I was literally walking by him at the buffet, and he said to me, you know, the game's looking great, but there's just not enough Earl in the game. And he said two things. He said that, and he said, the pitching scene looks great, but it's just not quite right. And so we talked about rotating the ball during the pitch, which wasn't, that wasn't really particularly, surprising thing to talk about. But his whole thing about not having enough Earl in the game changed the way we made the interface and had us add the ask Earl function into the game. And so the ask Earl function, required a bit of a rewrite in the code to sort of take all that strategy I just described and allow you to ask the system what you would do in a current situation. Again, there's limitations on these older computers about how much memory you can have. So it was a pretty, limited set of things that would happen. But fortunately, we had talked to Earl enough that one of the things that Earl said any number of times was, yeah, I understand what you're asking me in this situation, but sometimes you just got to let him play. And so that became our fallback to what I refer to as Ned Lerner's first rule of artificial intelligence, which is relevant in this day and age, which is never say something stupid, right? And so we always erred on if we couldn't really, if the AI, the internal AI, the logic couldn't figure out what was really the right thing to say at that moment, like you should put someone in the bullpen, it's pretty obvious, right? In the codes, we can figure that out. But if the system really couldn't figure it out, we would fall back to, you just got to let them play. I forget what the exact wording was, but there was that. I can't tell you how much fan mail we would get about how Earl was just so right on by just letting them play. More than almost any other comment we got about the strategy part of the game was that. And it was really the fallback in the AI, but it was also Earl's kind of thing. And one last story I'm going to tell about Earl, and that I'm going to there's more stuff to talk about here, but you guys might have some really specific questions about the oh, I'm going to switch to the next screen because it's another one of these GIFs. And I'm going to talk about two things. So one is about Earl on the road. So anytime he came to the West Coast, we would go spend time with him, right? And we went up to Oakland once. It was an evening game. And we were with him in the hotel in the afternoon, and we're showing him stuff and we're asking him questions. And there's some fun stories with that I'll get to maybe in a bit. But we asked him, we said, don't you need to rest or prepare for the game? And he laughed at us. He said, if I need to prepare now, I'm in the wrong business. He goes, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to prepare for the game. So we just kept on with him through dinner. And then we went and sat behind the dugout at the game. So that was a really pretty fun thing. The reason I wanted to show this is that there's one other phenomenon that happened in this game that I think is a pretty important kind of thing. And I've used this throughout my career, but nothing as much as when I did this game here, which was there's a lot of features in Earl Weaver that we added because we needed to debug the game. It had, frankly, nothing to do with what we thought users might want. Instant replay, slow motion instant replay, the ability to save a play and email it to someone else so they can see the play, right? What we're looking at here, which is a practice mode where you could just practice batting in certain situations. You can practice fielding. There's a fungo that goes on here somewhere. I think it's right, here's a fungo, right? Get to is the instruction, right? So these were all things that we did in the home run derby. In a large part, some of these were kind of in between, but like the instant replay and the saving the play and emailing around were fundamentally debugging tools. They were not really built for any other purpose, but everybody liked them so much, it's like, oh, we have to make this a feature. An instant replay is part of television, so that wasn't really a big thing. The moving of the fences, however, that was there from the get-go. I'm still surprised to this day that didn't become as common, and you guys can correct me because I don't play a lot of the other baseball games. just didn't seem as common for the longest time. And maybe it's still not common that you could just design your own ballpark, and it had a debugging feature to it, right? And I'll tell you what that was. And this gets back to the model, which is, if you remember what I said, is that if the pitcher throws the ball that based on the batter stats and the pitchers, and again, lefty righty stats, which Don, made us use, if this pitch is supposed to result in a double, right? What we did at the moment of impact of the bat, we said, based on an average park with average outfielders or average fielders and average base running ability, and frankly, nobody on base, this ball should result in a double, right? And most computer games, especially in that era, if it was going to be a double, it would follow one of three paths and it would always be a double. That was the end of the statistics. But we didn't do that. We said, and obviously Fenway is the obvious choice to talk about this, right? So we would have a table of doubles, right? Of trajectories, right? There's all kinds of doubles, right? There's doubles in the gap, there's doubles down the line, there's big high bouncing doubles that do weird things, right? There's all kinds of doubles off a normal fence, right? But if you're a right-handed batter and you're in Fenway and you get the double that's supposed to be a line drive or a home run, right? That's supposed to be a line drive home run, pulled because you're left-handed or right-handed, it's going to hit the wall, right? And so we had to be able to make baseball fields that were generic so that we could test all the plays in a generic environment. And then we would put generic average players in every position. And then we had to try all the different variations of singles, doubles, triples, and all the different kinds of outs, right? And so that was the basis of what we did. Moving the fences, editing the players all became a debugging or a programming testing tool to be able to do all of that. But we then added one other thing. So if you think back to that dance notation thing I did, I got asked to speak very early on, in 1982, I think, at a conference about using computers in the arts. And the speaker right before me was a professor at Stanford talking about simulating the human voice. And he did this whole long spiel, and it was very interesting. But at the very end, he said, this is what we discovered. If you take a 440 sine wave, so 440 is the note A on a piano, at least in America. You take a 440 cycle sine wave, and it is an exact pitch, right? It's what like a tuning fork would do, or an electronic A would come out. He said, and we tried all these different things. And then one of the people, might have been himself, said, why don't we just introduce some random errors into the wave? And he played it for us. And the moment they introduced random periodic errors into the wave, it sounded human. It was remarkable because we don't do perfect, right? We can't. And so I kept that in my head for a long time. And we came to the statistics model and we're running the doubles. And I got to tell you, you look at enough, even if there's a dozen doubles, you look at a dozen doubles long enough, you know where they're going to go, right? You just know it, right? It gets pretty dull. And so I introduced random periodic errors into all the flights of all the balls, mostly the hits. So all of a sudden, we went from having a dozen doubles to almost an infinite number of doubles, right? And we went so far as to even introduce a really tiny random error in the bounce of the ball, right? So mostly it would go straight, and every now and then it would like it hit a rock, right? It would go off a little bit, right? And we started introducing those errors everywhere in the system that was physically based. The throw from the outfielder, right? If he had a 7 arm, right? And he was thrown to third base from left field, right? We would adjust, we'd calculate what the actual throw would be, and then we'd throw the error in there, and it maybe was a little slower, maybe it was a little offline, right? And so it wouldn't necessarily generate an error, a baseball error, but it would possibly slow down the throw enough that the guy coming to third base might make it to third and not be out, right? And so So we did that. And in addition, and this is where I think it got particularly fun and really hard to debug, the thinking of the players also had an error in it, right? So the left fielders, right, gets a single. There's a runner trying to score from second base. And he's thinking, oh, I got this guy at home, right? I know I got this guy at home. Or better yet, yeah, I know I got this guy at home, right? And we introduce an error in there so that his confidence level is actually not accurate. It's close, but it's not accurate. So he's going to sometimes make that throw to home instead of holding the guy at first base on the single by throwing it to second. So their decisions are affected by a little bit of error. They're not perfect. And you start to add all that stuff up. And this gets to be the second big argument I have with Trip Hawkins, which is you have to build in streaks. And being a mathematician and having built this whole complicated ecosystem of, no, this is, the statistics and the errors and all the physics is really going to impact how this comes out. And over time, everything will work itself out, which it did. If I introduced a streak into that, everything was going to go up in the air. And I just didn't mathematically believe that it was a thing to do, and so we had a protracted argument and discussion about that. Don, to his great credit, got in the middle of that and talked Trip out of it. Anyway, so you can imagine you start to introduce all these errors in the system. It becomes remarkably difficult to verify how good it is. And the people at Computer Gaming World, is that the magazine? I think that's what it was. Big baseball fans, Johnny Wilson, and I forgot his partner's name. They became our first user testers, and they must have tested it for a year. And remember, they could send us plays, and they did. And so if there was some anomaly, they would send us the play. It would load up with all the players and all the situations, and we'd be able to watch it. We'd be able to debug the code. And it's like, no, that's how it's supposed to work. It's like, oops, no, we got to fix that. And then, did a lot of balancing, a lot of the strategy stuff. And, without them, and a guy named Happy Keller, who sadly he's in a hospice right now. He was one of my closest friends. He is one of my closest friends from that era. Literally moved down to Los Angeles and just, was at work with me every day testing. And without those folks doing the testing, we would never have had the balance that ultimately made this game, I think, as good as it was. Anyway, so I'm going to take a break. I'm going to drink a thing of water here. I got some other things to talk about, but I'd love to, answer some questions if, while we're still focusing on the sort of, original version, in the Amiga.
Well, I've got a couple of comments, and then, we can definitely throw some questions out there. So Eddie, I wanted to comment when I started out with my, video game experience. I had the Intellivision, went to a Commodore 64 in, let's say 83 or so. And I kind of got started with computer baseball from Strategic Simulations, and Micro League came next. But again, just as a, not even a comparison, but, we're talking about, small stick figure guys moving around on a screen. The physics, it repeated, you could tell that there were certain plays. As soon as the guy hit the ball, you knew exactly where it was going to land, whether the fielder was going to catch it or not, and so forth, right? So, basically when I moved to an Apple computer in, I'm going to say 86, got the Apple version of Earl Weaver, and I was like, oh, this is great. Well, a friend of mine introduced me to a classmate who had an Amiga and had Earl Weaver baseball on the Amiga. I was like, okay, this is blowing my mind here. The graphics are way better than the Apple version. This thing has speech. You can edit the players, the way the names are pronounced. The sound effects, the music were just it basically it took it to a next level. So I just wanted to comment on that, even the versions between the different systems were, the base of the game was there, right? But there was only so much you could do with an Apple II versus the Amiga.
Yeah, it was a challenge to build the Apple version in particular. Frankly, the first IBM version was easier to make, but that Apple version was really, really hard to do. It really was. I had by that time I had a team of guys helping me, and thankfully I did, because there was no way I could have done that on my own, like the Amiga version. Yeah, a guy named Mike Livesey did it. I don't know if you know his name, but he was another EA, kind of part of that community, and he wrote the most beautiful code. I have to say, it was the first time I actually really saw beautiful code. And he did a great job with a really, really limited machine. Do you remember the sound effects for building the ballpark on the Apple? That we did that in large part because, we didn't have loading icons, right? That wasn't a thing yet, right? So we had to do something to keep, to let you know that the computer didn't die and go to heaven while we were rendering the ballpark. So
which version did you originally build it for? And then I guess you ported it to the other systems after the fact. But which one was the first one?
Did I understand the question? Which one did I do it for first?
Correct. Yeah. Which of the Amiga, the IBM, Apple, and
so no, we did it on the Amiga, and then it was going over so well with the EA. And again, without Don's help, a lot of this wouldn't have happened because he was inside doing this. I think we were 8 or 9 months in. It was right after we signed with Earl that they allowed me, they gave me additional contracts to hire former Intellivision programmers and this guy, Mike Livesey, to sort of beef up my ability to do the other versions. And so we started doing, I'm pretty sure the Apple version was the second version that we worked on, but it was, I think the IBM was just a bigger, more capable computer. And, I know why. So the IBM one took longer, but we had to deal with Tandy, which is Radio Shack, where they were going to put it in their computers and distribute it as I forget what they call that, but it's like the software that comes on the computer. And so for every computer they sold, we got a free distribution. So I believe we started them at the same time, but the Apple got done first because we really had to scale back some stuff to make it work on an Apple, which clearly you discovered. And then I'm pretty sure that the IBM version started with 1.5. I don't think we ever did a 1.0 version on the IBM, but I could be wrong about that. I've got the boxes back there, but I don't know that it's that important. But we were able to do a bunch of stuff because of the Tandy thing. And IBM had all kinds of other interesting limitations because they had different color palettes depending on which video card you had in there. And Tandy had its own video card. So this is the TRS-80, right? The Trash 80 is what we call it, right?
Right. So like the Amiga, you're building for the very specific, the embedded sound chip and everything. And with the IBM, like you said, a different video. There were different sound cards available, right? So everything had a different driver. Yeah, I can imagine it was quite a handful to build that one.
It was. And with the Amiga, there were no choices. So it's like, you got the hardware that you got. You even had 2 mouse ports. Right. Or joystick ports. So you could choose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see anything in the chat, but I don't know if anybody wants to, they can unmute. And if you have any questions.
I got a question. I've got a question here. So when you went through everything with Earl, did you have a simulated argument with an ump?
Oh, absolutely, we do. And I wish someone had grabbed one. Not only that, I think I actually have, the famous, where is it? Come on. Nope, it's not here. I think I found it, but I didn't put it in the deck. We even have Earl with his hat backwards in here somewhere. And he kicks dirt on the ump, right? So, when he goes out and, there's actually a little animation of him kicking his foot and little specks of dirt fly up at the ump. So we absolutely did that. He didn't mind. He was pretty good about it. He did tell me, I don't know how true this is, but he did tell me that sometimes he would go out and shout at the ump about where they were going to have dinner, just so his players would feel like he was doing his job. He was pretty upfront about that. But yes, we absolutely have Earl come out. And in fact, we even talked to him about when he would come out and, under what circumstances. So absolutely Earl comes out and argues in the game. There's even a friend of mine did the voice of the ump in all the versions, a guy named Peter Sprague. And when he comes out to argue, because most of the time it's about who's out and who's safe, we have them going, especially in the Amiga version. I'm sure it's on some of the others, but in the Amiga version, he's literally going out safe, out safe, out safe. They're actually, you can hear them shouting at each other. So yeah, they argue.
What Earl was telling you about dinner and that, I actually worked with an NHL referee on some fundraising stuff. And those were exact discussions. He told me that some of the captains and players would have with him when the coaches on the bench were losing it. And the players were saying, yeah, you made the right call, but he's just an idiot. So yeah, I actually believe that was true. We do have a question here is now, were you able to save statistics like season-long statistics?
Oh yeah, that was a big deal. If you remember, I was talking about when the guys from Computer Gaming World were testing it, they were running full season simulations, and then we would look at how accurate were the overall, batting averages for the whole leagues, right? American's different than national, especially then, right? As well as individual players, did someone hit 80 home runs? That wasn't going to work, right? And so we actually relied on those full season simulations where we would save those statistics in order to validate that the model was doing what my intention, Don and my intention was, is that over the course of a 162 game season, that everything would even out, right? Sometimes you play in Fenway, but sometimes you play in one of those, 80s, plastic parks, that were totally symmetric and not very interesting. Right. It's more interesting now, but yeah. So if you play in enough different places against enough different pitchers and against enough different types of fielders, everything should come out in the wash, and you should get, a league batting average of 280, 270 something or whatever it was. And so we absolutely did that. And in the 1.5 version, I'm not sure about the Amiga version, but in the 1.5 version, and certainly in the Earl Weaver 2, your ability to modify what a season looked like was part and parcel of the commissioner's disc, right? You could do a 150 game season if you wanted to. You could set how long individual road trip series were. It's like, yeah, we can play them for up to 4 games per series or whatever, right? You could do more mixing between the leagues or no mixing between the leagues, right? You could set the leagues to be designated hitter or not, right? Especially for the older time leagues. There were balances for players that didn't have lefty righty stats, like, all the old time players before. I don't know when they started keeping them, but clearly the older players don't have that. So we had a way to simulate that. And the only way for us to validate it was by keeping the full season stats. That wasn't why we kept them, but we certainly leveraged that. And there's another debugging feature we came up to. Boy, they're just like popping out of my head. This may have come from Don or me, I'm not sure which, but we have this thing called one pitch mode, which I'm not sure anybody did before we did, which was we're going to roll up, we're going to roll up the play so that it's a 2-1 count, and here's the payoff pitch, right? Which reduced the game time from, an hour to 15 or 20 minutes, right? So we could really rapidly get through stuff, right? But we also had no graphics mode, right? Which you can only do if you're simulating it in the computer's memory, right? So you could literally play a game in a couple of seconds. So you could simulate a whole league and store all the stats, which was the question, right? I don't know, 20 minutes, half hour, you could do a 162 game season, right? And so we did a lot of that. So yeah, those things all went hand in hand.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions, but I just wanted to mention that using Earl Weaver, friends of my brother while he was in university, and I was actually just newly married, joined a league and I was an expansion team and they were doing all this. And being an expansion team, they do you no favors, as we always know. We all know. That is what actually introduced me into what has become and what is sabermetrics, because I was looking for guys they left available with a high on base percentage and, you know, various one of stats. And although I didn't win, I made the playoffs. Well, my brother finished in last, and you know that's really all that mattered at the time. But yeah, I mean, you know, and I've been playing in simulations and leagues ever since. Most of the years hockey, but you know, in the last 10 years, 15 years, it's been all baseball. I'm still in one hockey league, but the rest has been all baseball. Anybody else have some questions for Eddie? He says you mentioned being influenced by cards and dice games. Which ones in particular, and in any ways in which they influence the development of your games?
Well, as I mentioned early on, I only played the APA football game. So that was really it. I know that when we started at Intellivision, Don brought in some of his stuff. I honestly don't remember if he brought in Stratomatic or not. But they were all similar enough that, you know, I don't really remember spending a whole lot of time on those. I played a lot of other kinds of board games, but in terms of sports, it was really only APBA. That's a really interesting thought. Is I know I played them, but I haven't really sat down and thought, it's like, how did they influence some of the design choices that we made? I think part of it, I think maybe one of the things that was influenced by this, but it may have been the fact that we provide sort of those ratings for the players. There's a handful of ratings: how fast they run, how strong their arm is, how quickly the pitchers tire, right? Some of those ratings things, I think I would never have added to the system if it wasn't for the way APBA cards were built. I know that. Now that I'm thinking about it. But other than that, I would say that Don was probably much more the one influenced by the statistical models and that kind of thing that went on. Though I will say this, you know, I mean, really got my head thinking about this. The whole notion, to your point a little bit, of managing teams, right? Really, to me, comes from that, right? Because that's really where I killed my brother, was my ability to manage the teams, right, and make trades and, you know, really get the right lineups on the table. So I suppose that those things did, you know, again, those don't come from Don's model. Those comes from, you know, just us figuring out what the right things to do is. And I'm guessing, I'm certainly for him, having been seriously involved in those things much more than I was, especially with baseball. But that was a big thing, was managing those, and the excitement of getting the next year's team packages. That was so cool, right? You'd get them in the mail and there'd be, I forget how many football teams there were at the time, but you know, each one had its own envelope and you'd open it up and look at all your favorite players. So yeah.
I was just going to comment. One of my favorite things in early baseball was the ability to create your own ballpark, but you also allowed, you know, you can edit a player's stats. You can create a brand new team, a new league. So a lot of that stuff was really similar to the EA model of the construction set type of thing, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's interesting is that when we first signed the deal to start the work, there was no concept of the commissioner's disc. And I believe it was even sold as an add-on. I think that ultimately when you start to look at that whole system without that, I just think there would have been a big hole in the product line. So I guessing again that came from Don's you know, motivation, in the construction set was a huge deal at EA, you know, and so yeah, that may have been what motivated them to make that happen. This is actually a better question for Don than for me, you know, to find that one out. But I'm so glad that we did it. Anyway, Yeah, so let me get back onto this. There's only a couple more slides, but I want to talk about what happened afterwards. There's one last Earl story, even though this happens after the fact, after what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, sorry, the stories just keep coming. We brought the Amiga down into the dugout one day in Oakland. It was an afternoon game, and we came early. We had our pictures taken with him on the field. And we showed him the thing. And for those of you who are Star Trek fans, you're certainly going to appreciate this. You see my mouse? He did this. He picked up the mouse and he waved it at the screen. Just like Scotty does in Star Trek 4, right? And it's like, no, Earl, you have to actually roll the thing around. It was a pretty funny moment. He'd never been on a computer. So he just thought you'd like point it at the screen. It was pretty funny. And in that same dugout, that was the first time we showed him the ask Earl to make your lineups function. And he struggled mostly with this more than anything else that we worked with him on. He talked us through his entire philosophy about how to make lineups, right? So anytime I go sit in a baseball ballpark, people must hate sitting around because I'm always talking about, how you would pick a lineup and why this guy's, I'm pretty annoying. And anyway, so he really taught us a lot about picking lineups, especially, in an American League lineup, because that's what he was doing at the time. And he had really specific ideas about the type of player that bats in each position. But then when we actually put his players into the system and said, and here's the lineup that the system comes up with, he goes, that doesn't make any sense. And we explained to him that we were using last year's year-long statistics. He goes, why would you do that? And unfortunately, this was an area where we had to respectfully disagree with him because we couldn't do it the way he wanted to do it. He wanted to be looking at the season to date stats, or maybe even the last month's stats about the players and how they're currently playing. And we couldn't do that, right? We were always a year in arrears on the stats, but that took a long time for him to wrap his head around. And to his great credit, he eventually started to understand what the limitation was. And he worked with us to try and improve this thing. So we would say, okay, here's the team, here's the roster, here's the pitcher you're facing, right? How's this lineup feel to you? And he would start to give us feedback. But it took some time to get him around that. And then we did a press event at the San Francisco All-Star game. Must have been in the early 90s or late 80s. And so we did the event with him. This was spooky. We actually predicted an injury that was going to happen, that happened in the game. I don't know how the hell we did that, right? The injuries are just part of the Earl Weaver baseball simulation, right? They have an injury factor and we know if they get injured. And literally in the All-Star game simulation, someone got injured. And that person got injured that night in the game. It was just frighteningly spooky. But anyway, so my wife and I were going to go sit in the stands with Earl at Candlestick. I think it was Candlestick still at that time. And so we're getting ready to go. And Earl says, I really don't want to go. We're just like, okay, how come? He goes, because if I go, people are going to be pulling at me the whole time. I won't be able to go anywhere. I won't be able to enjoy the game. People are just going to be pulling at me the whole time. So that was actually kind of the last time we saw Earl at an event. We took him out to dinner in Sausalito, which is the little town right across the Golden Gate Bridge, and had a lovely dinner with him and his wife. But I thought it was a pretty interesting perspective, because he'd retired by then. It was a pretty interesting perspective that he just didn't want to be a celebrity. He just, liked doing his work. So anyway, I'm gonna leave the Earl stories at that. I'm sure there's more, but I want to move on to what happened in extra innings here. This is, to me, is a bit of I'm somewhat wistful about this. Earl Weaver 2 was really, to me, Don had left EA by this time. Earl Weaver 2 was really, to me, the fulfillment of Don's original request for me in Intellivision was, can we make it look like television? No one had done 3D moving graphics of any sport, and Doom hadn't come out yet, which is a 2.5D, kind of game. And so I knew the math. Matter of fact, I didn't have to change the math. It was already being done. What we had to do is periodically pick a camera angle and render the field fast enough and pick sizes of players and rotate the players. That was really the hard part. And by that time we had digitizing equipment. And so we hired an athlete to come in, and he was an EA marketing guy who was a semi-pro baseball player. We bought him a uniform and we put him in front of a camera, and we filmed him, and we photographed him in all these different positions with a stripy uniform so we could change the colors of the stripes. And we captured all the stuff that he did. And we ultimately did what Dim did, right? We captured him in 8 different positions, right? Front, back, side, 45-degree angles. And so we captured him. We put all that stuff into the animation system, which is fundamentally the same animation system. And then we had to, draw the ballpark so that we could switch camera angles when the moment came. And then came the hard part, was how do we decide which camera angle to use in which situation, right? And I'll be honest, I don't think we ever got it right. It was so hard. And we had 2 really, really hard things to do. One was to make an average IBM PC, because now we're only in the IBM world at this point in time. So this is in the early 90s, right? Apple II is not really a factor here. Amiga is not a factor. The only factor was the IBM PC. And so could we take an average IBM PC and render those graphics quickly enough? We knew we could do it on our computers. We had really high-end computers that look great, right? But the average person didn't. And we, quite frankly, it killed us. It killed the program. We still allowed you to look at the old view, but we were fighting so hard to try and make a miracle happen that we never really got it far enough along. I mean, it was heartbreaking to me. They brought in a whole crew of new young producers who'd never produced a game before and figured with this franchise they'd have success. And they weren't particularly helpful. We didn't have a Don Daglow around to really, help us, navigate, some of the decisions that we had to make. And it's pretty good, but it's not as good as we imagined. And it wasn't really good enough for the market, in my opinion. And in addition to all of that, the guys, they didn't, again, this is where we really missed having Don and Happy and a couple other of the original guys around. They didn't find a group of people that could help us test the efficacy, or that's not the right word, the quality of the model over a season. And so they did some testing, but the testing wasn't anywhere near as good. And, we were up against a timeline, and there was a decision made to release it, which in hindsight was really a poor decision. And they released it. It got totally bifurcated reviews. For those of you who remember, right? Some of the reviews really saw what we were accomplishing with it in total. And some reviews were so focused on the issues with the graphics and the camera angles and even some of the model issues that we got to, it basically destroyed the franchise from EA's perspective. And like any software at that time, we immediately went into, well, let's get a patch together. Let's do an updated release. We insisted on getting help from online community. I don't know if any of you were on that, but we had a whole CompuServe community spun up that was helping us test it. We gave them patched versions of the game, and we tuned the model. So, we made some improvements in what we call the director that changed the graphics. But the most important thing to us was that we got the model fixed, and EA never released it. We built it, we had it tested, we had it QA'd, and they never released it. And ultimately, I think that was the final nail in the Earl Weaver baseball coffin. But we did some things in that game that I am to this day very proud of. Never got leverage, but we built so that you could make mods to the application, right? Photoshop was kind of leading the way there, right? We could have a plugin that would give you a new feature in the application. We built the whole application so you literally could use it almost like a SaaS model, right? You could just tell it to run a play, and then give you back the results, right? You could do all of this. It was all architected into the system so that you could literally modify it to your heart's content, which was probably a bridge too far because, you know, no one ever seemed all that interested other than us in using it. The editable managers, though, I think was one of the better things that we did in there. You know, we had Earl as the base manager, but like editing the players, you could make yourself into a Sparky Anderson style manager you want, you know, and so that was one of the things. We added farm clubs, or at least an expansion of your team, so you could have a 40-man roster at the end of the season. And you know, anyway, so there was a bunch of things. You can see videos of it online if you haven't ever seen it, but it was, you know, we were pushing the envelope so hard, we just got out there a smidge too soon. And then what came next was a whole turnover at EA as they prepared to launch EA Sports. An entire new crew of people came in. People from other really successful sports franchises came in. And while that was happening, we had two ideas come at us. One was Play of the Day baseball, which was the short version of that is that it was just highlights, right? It's like you'd be playing left field and a ball was driven, you know, hard to the fence, and it was your job to jump up and catch it. It was kind of a very limited idea. They were just trying to take advantage of it. But the daily baseball thing is the thing that at the end of the day broke my heart that it didn't happen. A couple guys from Texas who were into, their business was doing online weather on CompuServe, right? So they had this, oddly enough, where I live in Boulder, Colorado now, which is where NCAR is, which is where all the weather in the United States is broadcast from. So they had a feed from NCAR, right? And they were giving people live access to weather feeds over the internet. It's all before the web, right? So this is all CompuServe kind of based stuff. And they came to me, they were baseball fans. I wish I could remember their names. And they said, couldn't you do the same thing for baseball using your model, using the Earl Weaver 2 engine? And we made a deal with Stats Inc., who I'm guessing you all know who Stats Inc. are, right? They were still a baby company at the time, right? They're the ones who drove all the stats then and drive all the stats now on television and everywhere else. Stats Inc. used to send, I assume they still do, they used to send a scorekeeper to every ballpark for every game. And every 15 minutes, that scorekeeper, they must have sent two, every 15 minutes, that scorekeeper would go to a payphone. They would call in all the plays and would go into their database at Stats Inc. And then the next day they would start to distribute it to those people who wanted that stuff. So we made a deal with Stats Inc. and Major League Baseball, and we would take a 15-minute delayed feed from Stats Inc., right? So they'd get it. It didn't take them long. It would go right into their database. So maybe it was a 20-minute delay. It would feed back into our system, and we would actually simulate the games that were going on throughout the country. So you could literally tune in and, you know, watch a game somewhere else as it was being played, 15 minutes delayed through the simulator. And we had all of that working. It was really fun to watch, right? You know, I was in Boston with one of the developers that we'd hired to help us do it, and we were watching a game in Los Angeles. I mean, it was pretty great. And as I said, EA had brought in a bunch of newbie producers, and they just let the ball drop on the whole thing. It literally evaporated, the whole project. It went from going 60 miles an hour. We've got this working. We can show you beyond a proof of concept that it's actually working. And then just like, I'm sure it was the advent of EA Sports that made that happen, but I'll never know. But it was literally like we couldn't get their attention. They would never follow through. They never made the final deal with Stats Inc. They never made the deal with Major League Baseball, and they basically just let the contract just slide. And, you know, to this day, there isn't a thing like that. So that was pretty devastating. And the one good thing that came of it was that there was a sportscaster in Los Angeles named Tony Hernandez, who became a friend of mine because he covered all of our press events, that we ran a league based on that same feed, but in the next morning, where people would manage their teams, but they would use last night's statistics to play this morning's games using the Earl Weaver model. So there was no play-by-play, or there was the text tape play-by-play that you get at the end of the game. And so every morning at 8 o'clock, Tony would turn on his answering machine, and people would literally 8 o'clock, you could not get through to his line, right? People would be banging on that. We had a whole league. We had 30 people trying to get to that phone line to hear him call the play-by-play for every game that got simulated at 6 in the morning from the stats that got downloaded at 4. And that was a really wildly successful thing. And EA had no interest in pursuing that one either. So those two things, we had teed up, we knew was wildly successful. It was to me, I'm blanking on the term. I'm not a traditional fantasy sports fan. I'm just not. I don't like the idea of scoring, and running up scores based on how your players did. I like the simulation. And so to me, this was an antidote to fantasy baseball, which was really had become a thing by then. So that was, just pardon the pun, but that was the end of an era for me. When EA Sports came in, they had me design the first EA Sports baseball game that they were going to build in-house using the Earl Weaver model. They had a really wonderful man signed up to build it. And again, just it went nowhere. We had all the deals signed and they never built it, but we had designed it. Matter of fact, I just sent all the designs to this museum on the East Coast so they'd have a record of the designs that we did for the original game. But that relationship, all the people that I was originally working with were all leaving EA or moving to other parts of the company. So it just went away. So then I went to work at Activision and stopped doing EA baseball. And so, so there's some other things that kind of followed from that. We did a game called Road to the Final Four with Bethesda Softworks. It was based on the same sort of general stats and physics model that Don had built, or Don had sort of instigated with me, right? Turns out I own the copyright to all the Earl Weaver baseball code. So that's why I was able to eventually I got a baseball for Windows 98 and 95 and all of that stuff, which I sold for a while. I don't know, must have been, maybe a couple hundred people eventually bought that, still out there if you wanted to ever download it onto a Windows machine. For fun, I made an iPhone version, which I think some of you may have had. I charged the exorbitant price of $9.99, for which I got endless grief. But I was more doing it for fun and to see if I could do it. And that came out, and that was okay. Used the same graphics as Earl Weaver 2. And then Playdom hired me years and years later to make a Facebook game with the NBA. Actually, they hired me to do sports, and then they said, do an NBA game first. And it's like, okay, we'll do that, but we should have done baseball first because I think we would have had more success. And Mark, is that your name? I think that that you might appreciate the fact that we actually took the same model and we built an NHL simulator, as a proof of concept that, that we said, look, we can roll these out. We understand how to build these simulations pretty quickly. So we used the same kind of model, but again, they weren't interested. And then there were a couple other follow-up things, Our Sports Baseball and Dominus were all sort of spun out of that relationship with Tony Hernandez and his son, who did linear weights modeling, which I got to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of that. Because it doesn't solve a lot of problems when you get to what I consider the classic simulation problem. When you do daily stuff, I've got a pitcher who threw a no-hitter against a guy who hit 2 home runs and a double. It's like mathematically, there's no solution to that. And so, to me, that's when a lot of the daily stuff starts to fall apart, is if you rely totally on a daily one-off thing, you end up with these impossible situations. And the linear weights modeling systems are all built around that kind of, and I don't know how familiar you are with those, but they're all built around, individual performances, and you immediately get into these conundrums of pitchers facing batters where you can't actually create a reasonable outcome. And then the final thing I say, and Derek knows about this, I'm at the stage in my career. I run a small software company. We have several clients, and we make software for people across a spectrum of different kinds of things. But we make apps, and we do big data, and we do AI, and we do all that stuff. We're a pretty small company, but we have a lot of clients that we help with, and so we've all become pretty familiar with sort of the latest technologies, and it started the very slow process of converting the Earl Weaver code over into a modern web-based system, so like JavaScript or something like that, so that we could make a web-based version of the game and put it out there and let people, use the Earl Weaver model and all the stuff that goes with it on a web-based platform. But that'll take a while to do. It's more of a labor of love than anything else. So anyway, that's my story. Those are my stories. And if there's any other questions, I'm glad to answer them.
I did see in the chat just a message from Tim. I wanted to tell you thanks for doing this. Very interesting insight. And let's see. What else? Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us, even the folks that maybe didn't join us on the call here, but the folks that'll do this video would be excited to hear about the web-based version. So, and probably a number of us would be interested in helping you test that out. So if that's something you're looking for, some folks to give you feedback on that along the way, that's something we can definitely share. If if you have a link or a website where you have a beta version up and running at some point, I'm sure we'd have a bunch of folks that would be happy to assist with that.
That would be awesome. And I have to say, it's always easier to do this stuff when you've got people who are chatting with you about it, because it's pretty motivating. And yeah, I started doing it with my son, and unfortunately I still have a full-time job, so I don't get a lot of spare time to do it. But we started laying out the groundwork for it. The good news is that all the modern front-end software makes a lot of this stuff pretty easy to architect all the framework. It's really converting the JavaScript code so that it's running in a cloud somewhere, and so that people can hit it. There's some interesting decisions and choices I have to make about whether or not the simulation is running locally, or whether or not it's like it does on an iPhone, or whether or not it's running remotely, so that we can do all the stuff on a server and not. Because today's modern browsers are so powerful that I think I may go back to the notion of running part of the simulator locally. So I'm sort of working through that, but I certainly appreciate the offer, and I will certainly take you up on it when I get to that point, and I will at some point. Clearly, I hope it comes through, but I clearly love this fairly long portion of my life where I spent thinking about building and evolving, this simulation. So that would be greatly appreciated.
I was just going to add, I know this is baseball focused, but if you wanted to just, run through a couple of your other non-baseball projects that you worked on over the years. I know we were talking about Return to Zork earlier, but I know you did some other things. So if you want to just briefly mention those as well. I'm sure some of us have probably played those games too, and maybe some of the folks weren't aware that your involvement in some of those.
Yeah, it's really only the two basketball games. So there was Road to the Final Four, as I said, that came out in, I want to say, 91, and that was based on the Earl Weaver 2 visual engine and the sort of stats and physics kind of model. So obviously it's different because you're not dealing with pitches and batters. You're dealing with, 1-on-1, 2-on-1, 2-on-2, 2-on-3. You're dealing with all these relationships. So, but we still did the same kind of thing where we would take the stats and build a sort of a model of a moment, right? It's like, I'm taking a shot. That's the easy one, right? I'm taking a shot at someone guarding me, right? What are the chances I'm going to do it? And then, oh, there's a rebound, and then you kind of have to do some similar things. The hockey thing was fairly similar to this, right? Where you're taking the idea of a one-to-one relationship, pitcher to batter, and you're making a many-to-many relationship depending on the players who are in proximity to the play, right? And then you fundamentally you roll a dice, pick a random number, right? And you look at how those relationships to statistics work, and you create the play, and then you go from there. I have to say, in both the basketball and the hockey game, those were almost purely statistics based, with a little bit of that sort of error thing going on in the decision making. Like, am I going to pass that ball to that guy? He looks like he's open, right? And sometimes they would just make a error in judgment, right? And so those kinds of things did play out, but the physics model wasn't as fundamental a part, in part because playing on a wood court or an ice rink, and the dimensions are the same, and there's not wind and stuff like that. So we really didn't use that there. The basketball game we did for Playdom started that way. It was a very interesting process that we went through with them. I will say this: I did get to meet Bill Russell and a couple of other really famous players. I'm blanking on who, but Bill Russell clearly just obviously stood out. If you remember, I was a big fan of, the Lakers and Chamberlain in the early days. So meeting Bill Russell in person was pretty awesome. And being only 5'7", it was particularly awesome. But anyway, that game started. It ultimately was the same model, right? It was in the because it was meant to be a Facebook game like the farming games. It wasn't really meant to be. It wasn't meant to be an action game in the same way, say, Earl Weaver was, or even NBA Road to the Final Four. And so we were trying to make a casual game that was still statistics based, and Playdom, in its wisdom, brought in a guy who was from the proper games industry, who still came right out of one of the bigger companies, and he was like, no, it needs to look like I'm blanking on everything right now. The video basketball game where people like light on fire and they shoot through space, and I'm blanking on what that game was, but it's a pretty famous basketball game it's a little over the top, but it's visually quite visceral, right? And you could do all these power-ups to your players and stuff like that. And it's like, this is meant to be a casual game you're playing on your Facebook feed. I'm not sure that's, so, we tried our best to morph that thing into what they wanted, but creating a whole animation engine around that in Flash in the time frame that we had wasn't going to work. And so I stayed with the project until it launched, just because I wanted to see it get out there. But it was, you could think about, matter of fact, this is a game I have designed in my head, and I've done some paper designs of it. For those of you who know Magic the Gathering, right, it really is more like a statistical sports game meets Magic the Gathering, right? So it's a card-based game, and you get the cards you deal, and you can order your deck, and you can do those things so that as every play comes up, you kind of have a moment where you have your cards on the table, I have my cards on the table or on the screen, as the case may be, right? And the outcome is determined by many factors, the stats being the foundation, but then all the other features that come with, a Magic the Gathering kind of thing would play in. And so, we built the game around that, and the kinds of things that we would add were things like, I don't know whether or not the crowd was going to give you, a boost because you're on the home team, or, we tried to make the power-ups not as magical as Magic the Gathering power-ups, but things that would be like, you took extra training this week, so yeah, I mean, or you didn't, or whatever. So so that you'd be influencing the game sort of around the edges, while the basic statistics were driving what you were doing. And so we built that game, and actually it didn't last very long. It was called NBA Legends. We had a license with the NBA, which is a very interesting thing because, for example, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will not allow himself to be licensed through the NBA. So we didn't have him. There's like a handful of players who were not in the data set. But, that wasn't ultimately an issue. So we had all these, classic players in the system. And again, I'm coming from, the success of Earl Weaver's, lifetime that people like playing with the players they grew up with, right? As well as the modern players. And the NBA got that. They were all in. And the marketing and product folks that played them were not quite so all in, but that's ultimately what released NBA Legends. They left it live for a sadly brief period of time after I left. But it did get nice reviews, and the players who played it really enjoyed it. The problem with those games is that those are, as I'm sure all of you know, is right. Those all make their money on people paying, 50 cents here, $1.50 there, $2 there, right, for this or that kind of extra little boost, to their farm or to their whatever. And that, I'll be honest, I had a lot of trouble designing that into the game. And so I think that's ultimately what they took it down, because they couldn't find a great way to monetize it. But like I said, the users who played it really, really enjoyed it. It was a really fun thing. And I still have this idea of doing this sort of Magic meets, and basketball is particularly easy to do it with. Magic meets, a statistical basketball simulator kind of card-based game where it's more turn-based. So you can play it on the subway, casually like that. So that was it. And the hockey game, like I said, was a proof of concept. We were able to run up scores and put players in and run their stats, and, a lot less scoring. So it was a lot easier to tell whether or not we were screwing up. And I'm not, being from LA before the Kings, it's like not a hockey person. So I had to rely on some other people to help me kind of understand how to make that work.
Got two more hopefully quick questions for you, and I know I appreciate we're running a bit late on time here, but let me just throw a couple more things out there.
Okay.
If I understand correctly, when you were done with the World Series, Major League Baseball at Mattel, you left and went to Atari briefly.
I did.
So was there anything you were working on then before the crash, kind of everything caved in on the industry in the late '83, I guess, early '84?
Wow, someone did their homework. Yes, I did. There was a crew of, I want to say 8 of us, including Dave Warhol, who is the guy who went to Intellivision with me from Pomona. We were hired by, it's funny, Don's colleague hired us there. He went with a first group. I got hired in the second tranche. The first tranche got sued by Mattel. And Atari had done a really spectacular job of creating a white room environment to reverse engineer the Intellivision and create their own documentation. So the suit went nowhere. So then they hired another handful of us to come in. We were hired, just to be clear, we were originally hired because Intellivision had gotten big enough that Atari saw that there were 4 million units out there that they could sell products for with their titles. And so I got asked to make pole position for the Intellivision. And so I worked on that for, I don't know, I want to say 6 months, and, some similar things, moving the pixels around and doing all that stuff and I got really good at pole position. We had one in the office. I was a pretty awesome driver. But as whoever asked the question said, the crash was coming, and Atari was looking to be sold, or we were in LA, and Atari's up in the Bay Area, so we didn't have a lot of communication with them, and we just kept our heads down. We were working, we were having a great time. It was a fun group, fun projects, and something happened in the business. I'm not really sure, but it was before the complete implosion of the first round of video game systems. And they said, stop. We don't want you to do that. we think the market is with kids games. So we want you to work with the Children's Television Workshop to make a game with them. And I don't know if you can see back there, but I ended up working for the Henson Company for about 4 years later in my career. Anyway, so I met a bunch of people that I ended up working with again later. And we made a game with, this was a Sesame Street game. So it was meant for little kids, which is often what happens with video game systems. Is they keep dropping the age to try and get a bigger market. So I made a game called The Honkers, which was a group of Sesame Street characters that have bicycle horns for noses. That was you had to help them find their way home by understanding the pitch and the duration of their honk. It was basically like a musical staff, and you kind of had to figure out, where they lived based on their nose. So that's what I did at Atari. And then the final moment was when is it Time Warner that bought them? The Tramiels. I know the name Tramiel was the people who bought Atari.
Tramiels bought them from Time Warner, I think.
Right. Okay. So the Tramiels bought them, and we're keeping our heads down. We don't know any better. We're just doing our work. And I don't remember what happened exactly, but we ended up on a call with somebody up at headquarters because we weren't really sure what to do. And we said, so, hey, we're in the Venice, LA office. What would you like us to do? They said, who the hell are you guys? And literally a week later, we all got pink slips. The guys in New York were way smarter than we were. I think they lasted a year before they were found and fired. So anyway, that was my experience with Atari, but it was pretty great. As I like to tell my kids' friends, I have an Atari shirt that's not from Target. And so, but it was pretty fun, and it was fun to be around because we did get to meet a lot of the people who were proper Atari folks in our first couple months there. So that was fun. And then after that, I did some freelance work, and then Don called me.
My last question, arcade versus sim mode. Did you go back and forth with, which, how important it was to have both modes in the game?
I'm so glad you asked that question. It's a really important question. This was another area. This wasn't Trip necessarily, but it was definitely the EA marketing and product department that were like, you have to have an action mode in this game. You have to have an action mode in this game. And Don wasn't opposed to it. I wasn't necessarily opposed to it because certainly the Intellivision was an action game. But it certainly threw a wrench into the works, right? It's one of the reasons that practice mode came about, right? Is we kind of had to make that work. That happened, I think, even before Earl joined. I mean, that happened in the first 6 to 8 months where we were having a debate about whether or not it was just going to be a simulator, which, I had to say that was more Don's thing than mine, but he certainly, he brought me along, and, I was kind of his guy. So it's like, yeah, the simulator's the thing, but we need to make an action mode. And we made some decisions that still stand apart from the rest of the action mode world. And, when Don did LaRussa, he took a lot of things that he felt we did wrong, and he did them probably right in LaRussa, especially like catching fly balls. If you remember the circle, you run to the circle and it would get smaller and try to get to the middle of the circle. I think that's how it worked. Fielding was particularly challenging in the system, but it was, I want to say it was a debate for probably a couple of months. And I think my only reticence to doing it was having to re-architect some things that I really, no one wants to go back and re-architect things that are already working. So I think that was more my reticence. And I'm not an action player, in spite of my great luck with pole position. I'm really not an action player person, much to my kids' chagrin. Don't like to play action games, and so I got plenty of help on that. And the pitching system in particular, I think was something that we cooked up. Specifically, that came later. I think the decision about how we did the pitching and the batting, both of those things, those came later as we tried to finalize we really tried to make the pitching work with Earl's philosophy of calling games. And I, for the life of me, I can't remember. I don't think we ever give advice about how to call pitches, but we give advice to the pitchers, the simulated pitchers. And so we built the mechanism for pitching around what we knew the pitchers could do. But we did allow, and was just we ran out of space. We couldn't limit the pitches to the pitcher. So every pitcher had a screwball, which, as we all know, most pitchers don't have a screwball, and every pitcher had a knuckleball. And it's like, I don't think we ever built in the limitations. We might've tried to do it in Earl Weaver too, but I don't think we succeeded if we did. So wasn't my favorite mode. I was totally focused on that, but there was a whole crew of people up at EA who were big into the action mode. And the batting, I don't know how people felt about the batting, but for those of you who never played in action mode, you hold the key down and you release it to swing. And the whole reason I played as a kid, and the whole reason I felt that way, that I designed it that way, was because I wanted to give the feel of the backswing before you came through your full swing, because I wanted to get that notion of the check swing in there. And so that was that was what we came up with. And, we never got a lot of negative feedback or positive feedback about the mechanics of that system. So, I mean, if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them, but a little late, but I'd still love to hear them. But yeah, it was that part. So I'm going to contradict myself. That part of the system, now that I think about it, we added a feature where you could just do the action mode in the pitching. You remember that? You could turn off the fielding.
I'll be honest with you. I think probably 95% of the time or more, I played the simulation. I did not play the action mode, but I feel like, it's good to have both. You can attract players that only like the action mode, right? You can kind of get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and that other mode that I'm talking is this in-between mode where you could have auto fielding on and auto base running on, allowed you to focus on what you spend most of the time doing in a baseball game, which is pitching and batting. So, and that we had a big enough screen so you could actually kind of do it. So yeah. And in the end, that I think was a good decision, by EA to push us to do it.
Well, that's all the questions that I've got. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in, but Eddie, I really appreciate, you taking almost 2 hours to spend with us, and all the stories about designing the games, and the stories with Earl. Excellent presentation, and really appreciate again you coming on with us.
It's my pleasure, and as I'm glad to say, that was released in 1987. So, we're 35 years, right? And it's astounding and humbling to me that people still care about something that we did so long ago. And it makes me very, very proud, and I'm pleased to have done this. So thank you.
Well, I don't know if you can see in the background here, but there's a Commodore monitor and there's an Amiga 500. I purchased an Amiga specifically to play Earl Weaver baseball. I don't know that I ever bought another game for it.
There's some other good games for it.
I know there are.
All right. Well, again, my pleasure, and thank you all for letting me share.
All right. Thanks again, guys.
All right.
Everybody have a good night.
Night, everybody.
All right.
Hopefully we'll see some of you next week in Chicago.
Yep. Take care.